That was a very artfully written panel. It's long. Anyway, that's what we're going to be talking about more or less for our last panel. And what I would like to do, if you'll indulge me, is I'm going to introduce all three panelists in the beginning. That way I can relax and listen to the papers, and then we'll just have them go one by one, if you'll indulge me in that. First, I have to my right Professor Timothy Shaw, who is a research professor in the Department of Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance, the Graduate Program Director of Global Governance and Human Security in the McCormack Graduate School at the University of Massachusetts at Boston. Professor Shaw has a very long list of publications and a very long list of accomplishments, so I'll just read off a few here if you'll indulge me. He has his degree from Princeton University, and he joined the Department of Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance in fall 2012. There at UMass Boston, as I said, is also the Graduate Program Director. He has a kind of extraordinary record in publication and also really in innovative administration, both as a scholar and administrator. Most recently, he is the professor and director of the Institute of International Relations. He was at the University of the West Indies in St. Augustine in Trinidad. He's been the Associate Research Fellow at UNU in Comparative Regional Integration Studies in Bruges, and the list goes on. Let me just list for you a couple of his most recent publications and also say that Dr. Shaw edits the International Political Economy book series for both Ashgate Publishing and Palgrave Macmillan, which is in and of itself quite an accomplishment. His most recent co-edited works include Diplomacies of Small States, which says it's forthcoming here. I don't know if it's come out quite yet, or is it due?
The second paperback edition has just come.
Oh, there you go. I see I have it all wrong. Sorry. Africa and Ireland in the 21st Century, Rethinking Development Challenges for Public Policy, and also the Ashgate Research Companion to Regionalisms. He also, at the University of London, remains a professor emeritus. I think that's quite enough introduction, and today, and there's more I could say, and today his paper will be entitled, Innovation for Regional Development in the Global South, Theory and Policy in the 21st Century. You know what, we'll just introduce one at a time. Let's do it that way, I take it back. Please, Professor Shaw.
Thank you.
Such a long introduction.
And let me thank in turn Rebecca and Markus and Christine and their graduate students for a very welcome return to the other campus in Miami, connected to the EU Center. And I did bring some copies of the most recent flyers, both for the book series and also for our new PhD, recognizing that you have you in some ways are producing the ideal applicant for us in terms of your new master's program. And I very much hope that this meeting will lead to a title around innovation, because I do not have anything on innovation and regionalism in the IPE, the regionalism series. I think it's a very exciting time, as suggested by the first overhead, to be looking at comparative regionalisms, a world of 200 states, especially, of course, Africa, which itself has more than a quarter of those states. And I think that I've been challenged by your focus on innovation, particularly applied to the Global South, especially Africa. And I think 5, 10, 15 years ago, people would have suggested that that was an impossible leap to suggest that anything innovative came out of Africa. But the paper uses your focus as an excuse for beginning a discussion which is emerging in the African literature about African agency, i.e. innovation, rather than African dependency, and the emergence of developmental rather than fragile states. And in a way, this goes back to Bill's presentation this morning on the BRICS. So the paper starts off looking at the whole question of natural resources, because the governance of natural resources is a particular concern in Africa, as around the world, both in terms of environment, but obviously in terms of sustainable development. And a recent Chatham House review of natural resources talks about how the political economy of natural resources is is increasingly shaped by the large structural shifts underway in the world. The world must now contend not just with growing environmental threats such as climate change and water scarcities, but also with the shift in consumer power from west to east, concentration of resource ownership, and the rise of something we were talking about this morning, state capitalism. All these moving pieces are changing the rules of the game. End quote. This month, the UNDP has just released its latest Human Development Report, focusing on the rise of the South. And this month, The Economist has just produced a special report on emerging Africa. There are new books in press dealing with African agency, including one that looks at how Angola has controlled the Exim Bank of China in its own particular political economy. So although the literature still talks about fragile and failed states, it does seem to me that Africa increasingly can claim to have its own developmental states as advocated by the UN Economic Commission for Africa. So if one looks at Zakaria's idea of the rest, both state and non-state, in the emerging post-American world, it seems to me that increasingly Africa and other parts of the global south are of increasing importance. And Jan Nedeveen-Petersen has suggested that the north-south axis is increasingly being superseded by an east-south turn. So although it may sound counterintuitive, the whole question of an African renaissance is increasingly on the agenda, and I think informs studies of comparative regionalism in the global south, as increasingly we anticipate a post-2015, post-Millennium Development Goals world. But I also look not only at a range of issues around things like forestry, fisheries, etc., but also the degree to which conflicts, climate change, health threats, crime, drugs, guns also move and are increasingly the stuff of both global governance and human security. And look in particular at the emergence of a new regional energy region in eastern Africa. Increasingly then, as suggested during the day, over the next 5 years, the average African economy will probably grow even faster than its Asian counterpart. And therefore, this whole question of Africa's lions compared to Asia's tigers and the turkeys of the world are of growing importance. So the paper is concerned with global rebalancing, which of course is in a sense reinforced by the difficulties in Europe over the pigs of the Eurozone and the increasing role of direct foreign investment and official development assistance from non-traditional partners, particularly the BRICS, but also the other emerging economies like Turkey, plus the rise of non-state actors in terms of assistance and education, faith-based new foundations, etc. But in terms of African agency and innovation, I particularly want to focus on 3 or 4 that I'd be happy to discuss further in questions. The African mining vision concerned with sustainable development, the prospects for an Eastern African energy region in terms of Dodd-Frank supply chains from the Congo around conflict minerals, and the novel West African Commission on Drugs, paralleling the earlier Latin American Commission and now the Global Commission. And that in turn is then leading to the emergence of a debate about African agency, with William Brown suggesting that, quote, future work on African agency will be able to engage seriously with the continent's role in international politics in a way that presents Africa as actor, not just acted upon, historical agent, not just history's recipient. And I think that this is reinforced by the rise of new forms of regionalism around new IT, the mobile phone, the internet, and increasingly questions of energy and water. So, to start off with African regionalisms by 2015, I look at 6 major developments that suggest that regional development is very much happening as 2015 is anticipated. First, African regions, perhaps somewhat parallel to Turkey, have generated a series of innovations from the Maputo Corridor to Trans-Frontier Peace Parks and the tripartite free trade agreement between SADC, East African Unity, and COMESA. Secondly, African stakeholders have been central to a set of innovations in transnational governance, such as the Kimberley process on conflict diamonds, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, etc. Third, as already indicated, the continent has begun to articulate its own African mining vision, particularly in terms of artisanal and small-scale mining and supply chain management. Fourth, South Africa has been elevated, as we know this week in terms of the latest BRICS summit in Durban, as the fifth member of the BRICS, along with Brazil, India, etc., and plays an important role, as does Turkey, in terms of regional foreign policy. Fifth, if we expand our purview from the continent itself to its diasporas concentrated in Europe and North America, agency through remittances is likely to become even more influential in the years ahead. And finally, if we go beyond the formal and legal to gangs and guns, certainly there are ways in which African agency is increasingly determined by such informal flows across particularly landlocked borders. The second part of the paper looks at comparative regionalisms, and as you can see in the first part, I quote my fellow Canadian Amitabh Acharya in terms of whether comparative regionalism is a field whose time has come, and particularly the evolution of the second world of BRICS and other emerging economies. And at the bottom, it seems to me there's some very important and interesting authors who are determining the state of the field. So as I've already said, I take African agency to be particularly central in these 3 or 4 cases, and I'll come on in a minute to questions like the Eastern African energy region, and I've already cited UNDP and the economics. And it seems to me that in turn, and I'll come on to this before I close, there are a variety of issues and perspectives, particularly obviously of a somewhat multidisciplinary kind, that arise out of these changes in the place of the global south, exacerbated by the difficulties in the historic transatlantic north. So the rest of the paper has 4 interrelated parts which look for a possible renaissance in Africa. And as I've already suggested, this is contained or emphasized by the whole idea of African agency. The Maputo Corridor, the Kagagadi Trans-Frontier Peace Park, the Nile Basin Initiative, and in terms of Dodd-Frank, the International Conference on the Great Lakes region, in terms of conflict minerals. Secondly, and this comes particularly out of teaching our course on global governance, the rise of new multilateralisms, or the rise of transnational governance with African dimensions, from the international campaign to ban landmines, an Ottawa process, the Kimberley process, and the Diamond Development Initiative, and now the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. Thirdly, post-Washington Consensus, increasingly development assistance from the OECD is of declining importance. And I suggest in the paper that the leading group has come up with a variety of new forms of finance, including the currency transaction tax, carbon taxes, climate change funds, controls on money laundering, remittance taxes, etc. And increasingly the new donors are not just the BRICS, but also the Gulf states, sovereign wealth funds, faith-based organizations, new private foundations, etc. And here I think the role of countries like Turkey is of growing importance. And finally then, I think we need to ask questions about who are the drivers of these particular directions, and I'll come on to the implications in terms of analysis in just a minute. So in terms of new regionalisms, Africa has been particularly important and influential, and because of the rise of developmental states, has begun to define new forms of regionalism, like the trilateral free trade area and the trademark initiative in southern and eastern Africa, encouraging a variety of regional infrastructures, networks, and supply chains. So that the East African community, when I was a graduate student at Makerere, it was just 3 states with a variety of functions. It collapsed because of Idi Amin. Now it is back in a variety of ways, including civil society, parliaments, media, but it's also grown from 3 to 5, and if the new state of South Sudan is included, to 6. And in turn, because of Dodd-Frank, the International Conference on the Great Lakes region has been a very important part in terms of monitoring conflict minerals. Africa also indicates the way in which the macro, the meso, the micro are interrelated, and has also been at the forefront of developing responses to climate change as a very vulnerable continent. The development of the BRICS into IPSA and BASIC around the Conference of the Parties in Copenhagen and elsewhere. Fourth, in terms of the development of new regions, the discovery of oil in Uganda on the border with Congo, and now in northern Kenya, southern Tanzania, northern Mozambique, means that increasingly Eastern Africa is being looked at as a new energy region, where with questions of pipelines becoming as important as they are in Eastern Europe and Central Europe, of course involving a range of multinational companies, including state-owned enterprises. Fifth, obviously, the continent's interregional relations are also in flux, particularly between Africa and China, between Africa and India, but also with South Korea and with Japan. And finally, of course, Africa, because of so many landlocked states, the idea of regionalism comes naturally. The fourth part of the paper talks about the variety of forms of transnational governance. And certainly teaching the course, it has made me even more aware of the way in which new global issues are increasingly being dealt with, not just by states, not just by non-state actors, but by a very interesting mix. Many of them coming out in new forms of coalitions, agencies, networks, particularly based on public diplomacy. I've already talked about innovative sources of finance, but obviously the currency transaction tax, the airline ticket levy, carbon taxes, remittance taxes, etc. Let me then conclude by the whole question of the implications for analysis. Because it does seem to me that, and that's why this conference or this focus on innovation is so timely, that we increasingly need to rethink what we mean by regionalisms, and whether the regionalisms are primarily state or non-state, formal or informal in origin, in terms of drivers, in terms of catalysts. And here the African mining vision, along with the earlier tripartite free trade area, the Kimberley process, the African, particularly the Eastern African regional energy area, it seems to me is very important and symbolic. There are other forms of natural resource governance being proposed by the World Bank, by the sector, but the African mining vision, which has only just been articulated based on an international report, is something I think that one would not have anticipated from the continent in previous decades. So the paper concludes that Africa at the turn of the second decade of the 21st century is at a crossroads in terms of the future of developmental rather than fragile or failed states, and that the whole notion of innovation seems to me to resonate very nicely with ideas about African agency that are increasingly on both the analytic and the policy agenda. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, of course. Next we turn to Dr. Konstantinos Kourtikakis. Kostas is a lecturer and research assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. His area of expertise includes European Union politics, and his research examines political institutions, institutional transfers, interorganizational networks, and foreign policy. and he's come here today to talk with us about, unless he's changed his title, no, I don't think he has. I got yours wrong because you changed yours, Tim. Networks and Innovation in EU External Relations. And I have the spread of practices in the European neighborhood. So thank you so much.
That sounds great.
Great.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and I'd like to thank all the organizers for inviting us all over, and for giving me the opportunity to talk with the American flag in the background, which is a first for me. It makes me feel a little bit like the President of the United States at a podium, you know, in the White House. So that's good. I would like to point out that there's two of us working on this project. There's me, you can see my name there, and then there is Katerina Turkina at HEC Montreal. This is a business school, so there's a political scientist and somebody who works in a business school who has that inter-organizational perspective, and we're combining our insights. So we're asking political science questions, and we're trying to get answers using methodologies that are used in inter-organizational analysis and some part of sociology as well. So Kasia is not here. She's responsible primarily for the statistical analysis. So, you know, some of the questions I'll defer to her. She can be over here. And I would like also to point out that this is a project which we're in the second year. This is a project that's financed by the European Commission through the European Union Center of Excellence grants. So Katia and I were part of that proposal for the University of Illinois, so we've got some funding, and so we're doing this together. And so we've started looking at these networks, which is the next thing I'm going to come to. So what do we study? You know, what is our subject? So we're studying inter-organizational networks. So what are these? These are networks, okay, among organizations, obviously. But what kind of organizations? These are hybrid networks, or the kind of networks we're looking at are hybrid. So they are primarily composed of civil society organization, businesses, so private non-profit groups, but they also have some government agencies as well, particularly European Union institutions, so the Commission and some national governments. But most of the actors that participate in those networks are actually civil society organizations, non-profit organizations, okay? And so we're looking at those networks that include organizations in EU member states and the so-called countries of the neighborhood. And we're looking in particular at two neighborhoods. The first one is the Union for the Mediterranean, also known as the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership. So that would be networks that have organizations from an EU member state or several EU member states in France, Spain, Italy, and then organizations from Morocco, Egypt, Jordan, etc., etc. Okay, so you have a mixture. So they're all private, non-profit organizations, and they all form these networks. The second neighborhood that we're looking at is the Eastern Partnership, which is to the east of the European Union. So it's that part to go with the theme that started earlier today. That's between the EU and Russia. Okay, we're very close to that. Both of these initiatives are part of the European Neighborhood Policy, the regional sort of arms. But most of the funds actually come from the funds that the EU has set aside for the European Neighborhood Policy. So the way it works is that an organization in France works with another organization in Spain, and they say, can we submit a proposal together to get funding? And how do they get funding? By finding an organization in Morocco, an organization in Jordan, so they form these networks, okay? And the idea here is that these networks, these not civil society organizations, by networking, they exchange ideas, practices, and we're looking in particular at networks of employers and employee organizations, so business associations and labor unions, okay? So we have these networks in the Eastern Partnership and in the Union for the Mediterranean of labor unions and and business associations. They're all part of the same network, okay? And so they exchange ideas, they meet together, on a regular basis, they have meetings, they have conferences, they do projects together. So, the members of the network, they will then get finance from the Commission to do projects like depolluting the Mediterranean Sea, well, not in this particular case, but, how they can exchange practices and so on. It's, the depollution part is part of a previous project, so it's about that. So just to give you an idea, just very briefly, I'm going to show these maps. So this is a map of the Union for the Mediterranean or the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership. These are the countries that are involved. So Libya, as you can see, is kind of problematic there. So it's countries from the EU or organizations, labor union and employer associations from the EU and these countries. That's one part of this partnership. And the other one is the Eastern Partnership. So that's countries from the EU in blue and then those countries in orange. As you can see, there is Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, and then Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia further away. Okay? So what are the questions that we're asking about these networks? First of all, what is the level of cooperation that is achieved within these networks? So, yes, these networks exist. There's no question about this. We have the official roster of membership. But we're asking, is there any exchange of ideas actually going on? Do they cooperate? Do they go to the meetings, or are they just empty shells that these networks have been established to get funding from the Commission, and then nothing happens? So the first thing, at the very basic level, is there cooperation? The second question is, what is the structure of cooperation? So who cooperates with whom? Okay, is it primarily labor unions working with labor unions? Employer association working with employer association? Is it labor unions working with employer associations? Does this happen cross-nationally, or does this cooperation stay within individual countries? So we want to see the structure of cooperation. And the last one is, what is the outcome of cooperation? Do any practices actually get transferred? Okay, the labor unions actually, through all this process of negotiations, do they get anything out of this? An employer association, or they just talk, and nothing happens? All right. So these are the three main questions, and I'd like to point that this is a progress. This is a project in progress. So we're still trying to figure out certain things, but I think we have a good idea of what's going on. I'll talk about our main hypotheses. There are 4 of them, and then I'll talk about our data, how we collected the data, and then I'll present the results. So we have a number of hypotheses. Some of them are based on the literature, like the first 2, and some of them they're new hypotheses, so we're trying to explore certain things for the first time, so there's not a lot of grounding in the literature. And there's no literature on this topic, on intergovernmental organizational networks, so we're sort of breaking new ground, and we're trying to link our hypotheses with what's going on with transnational cooperation of labor, transnational cooperation of employment, or employer organizations, businesses, etc., etc. So our first hypothesis has to do with the relation with time and the degree of cooperation. So the longer members of inter-organizational networks cooperate, the more dense cooperation in those networks become. Okay? And from our previous research, we expect that the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership, which has been around for a lot longer, since 1995, we expect to find closer cooperation, more dense cooperation. So labor unions and employer associations work with each other more, and they meet with each other a lot more than in the Eastern Partnership, which is a much newer initiative. It started in 2008. Okay, so we expect to find that over time, so these relations to develop, it takes time. So we expect to find variation over time, but also across space between the Eastern Partnership and the Mediterranean Partnership. Our second hypothesis, so we're going to test that. The second hypothesis is in inter-organizational networks, cooperation among employer organizations is more intense than among labor union organizations. Okay? There's literature that argues that businesses tend to be more transnational than labor unions. And so, based on that, we expect to find a similar situation in these initiatives as well. So we expect businesses to work with each other a lot and exchange practices a lot more than labor unions with each other. Okay, so we want to test whether that's true in this case or not, what's going on. We'll see. All right? Third hypothesis. Our interactions in inter-organizational networks lead to change in labor union and employer organization practices. So here we're switching from examining the structure of cooperation to the outcome of cooperation. So does anything actually get transferred from one actor to the other in those networks? Okay, so that's the first thing. At a very, very, very basic level, is there any interaction going on that leads to exchange of practices and change of policy? And the last hypothesis is inter-organizational networks cause more change of practice among employers than among labor unions. And that's sort of the logical conclusion of our previous two hypotheses. That's brand new. We're testing it for the first time. Since there's more cooperation among employer associations than among labor unions, if there's any exchange of ideas and practices, then we expect to find that employer organizations copy each other more and they hear each other more than labor unions do. Okay? So again, I don't think those are very complicated relations. They're pretty simple, but we're testing them for the first time. So for us, it's interesting to see how that works out in this particular case. And I would like to point out something that I didn't say in the beginning, but what the EU is essentially trying to do through this is export its neo-corporatist model to the countries of the neighborhood. Okay? Because the idea behind that is, how do you have a developed economy and developed democracy is by having those social partners, this neo-corporate structure, labor and business talk to each other, and that enhances both economic development and also democratic development. And there is, communications from the Commission on that. There is, it's expressed in the funding regulations. So it's an express goal of the Commission. They don't use the word neo-corporatism, but they're using the word economic development and democracy, the promotion of democracy. So, just to be precise, so it leads me to believe that, if that's what they're promoting and they want to promote democracy, there is some neo-corporatist model behind that. Okay. Data sources, and I'm just going to go quickly because I think I'm not sure how I'm doing with time. Not great, well, always. So we actually sent out a survey. So we have the roster of these organizations that participate in the networks, and we sent out a survey. It's an online survey. They click, so we have their information. So the recipients, they click the answers, and I'm happy to make that available to you if you're interested in the survey questions. And there are about 500 organizations that participate in these networks that we know of. We have, so far, a response rate of about 33%. Okay, so that's not excellent, but that's not too bad. It allows us to do a regression, some basic statistical analysis. And we're still getting answers back as we speak. So hopefully, we're presenting this at the Midwest Political Science Conference, so we'll have more results by then. So it's sort of work in progress, as I said. And we're looking in particular at two projects that the EU is financing, and it gives incentives to organizations to get funding. The first is called TrustNet, which is a project in the Mediterranean, and the second one is called the Civil Society Forum, which is in the Eastern Partnership. Again, I'll be happy to give more questions. The important thing is that these organizations can get funding from the European Union to form these networks in the Mediterranean and the Eastern Partnership. Results. Okay. I hope I get to my cool diagrams in the end. I think they're cool, but hopefully So first of all, results. Our first hypothesis is confirmed from the results. The length of cooperation is important, so the longer these networks exist, the more dense the relations are. And cooperation is stronger in the Mediterranean than the Eastern Partnership. Okay? And so here's, we did a study of network density, so we try to find out how dense relations are, how direct relations, how many direct relations there are between labor unions and employer associations in those networks. So do they communicate with each other, and how dense is that cooperation? And as you can see, in the Mediterranean, on average, these networks are a lot denser. Oops, what did I do? Okay. So you can see that the Mediterranean density is 17%, and it increased to 26% over time. So our time point is 2008, 2012, so it's fairly recent data. And you can see that also in the Eastern Partnership, density, so the amount of connections, they went up. But the Mediterranean figures are a lot higher than the Eastern Partnership figures, okay? So it confirms our hypothesis that we set out originally. Second hypothesis, employer organizations network with their peers more than labor unions do, so our certain hypothesis is confirmed. Here is the data, so I know it's a lot of things, but as you can see, the first one has sort of how labor unions work with other labor unions, essentially. Okay, how close do they work together? And as you can see, labor unions in the Mediterranean network, there's a 5.8 indicator. Okay, so that shows that it's pretty low, versus the employer organizations that work together, and their coefficient there, their number is 24%. Okay, so in the Mediterranean, labor unions work, employer employers organizations work with each other 4 times more than labor unions do. Okay? And it's a similar figure for the Eastern Partnership in every year. All right? So generally speaking, we find a lot more cooperation among employer organizations than among labor unions, cross-regional variations, and over time, generally, this cooperation increases. Okay. Our final set of results, hypotheses 3 and 4. Both types of organizations adopt what they consider as efficient practices. So in the survey, we asked them, so first of all, who are the other organizations you work with? And second, do you adopt any practices that you hear about from these other organizations? Whether labor unions, employer organizations, it doesn't matter. We have a list of all the other partners, and they have to click and say, we work with that organization, this organization, etc. Okay? So there is a lot of exchange of ideas and good practices, definitely. Okay? So it's not just an empty shell, those networks, there's something actually going on. But labor unions network with employer organizations more than with each other. Okay, so that's interesting. So labor unions don't work with other labor unions, but with employer associations, which makes a lot of sense, But it's still, I think it's interesting that it happens even transnationally sometimes. And networks cause more change in employer practices than in labor union practices. So employers or organizations, they listen to other employer organizations a lot more, so they share more practice and ideas than labor unions listen to other labor unions. Okay, so I hope this makes sense. I don't know if you can see that, and this is sort of the table that I'm dreading to show you because it takes a little bit of explanation. Here we have these coefficients. They show this is part of a logistic regression analysis, and I'll talk about in detail later. But this is who are the organizations that receive practices, they adopt practices. So this is for employer organizations, this is for labor unions, and this is who they adopt those practices from. So, in this box you have, employer organizations, adopting practices from labor unions. In this box you have employer organizations adopting practices from other employer organizations. I'm almost done. Okay. And as you can see, generally speaking, so first of all these numbers are statistically significant, which means they're important, there's something going on, so statistically there's something going on, okay? But you see that employers adopt practices from other employers a lot more, than any other set of organizations adopt practices from each other. Labor unions, generally speaking, look at this. If you look at the number of the coefficient, this is 0.005, so it's very, very, very low. So employer organizations and labor unions, they exchange ideas very, very little. Okay? So, I can talk a little bit about the content of the exchange of the Q&A. So what do they actually exchange? Okay. Last thing I wanted to show you, this is actually a depiction of networks, the one that we're able to get. And as you can see, red dots are labor unions, blue dots are employer associations. This is in the Mediterranean network between 2008 and 2012. You can see, well, I don't know if you can see that very clearly, but there's, first of all, more connections here than there are here. So there's more density going from 2008 to 2012. And also look at how connected labor unions are with employer associations. So every blue dot is connected with a lot of red dots. Okay? And then you might notice that these blue dots are connected to each other, from different countries, but the red dots really don't communicate with red dots, far away. So again, I have diagrams like this for all the years that we're doing and the two different partnerships, but I think I'm out of time, so I'm gonna leave it at this, and then I can answer more questions at the Q&A.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Great. And last but definitely not least, this whole conference, we have Beverly Barret. She is a doctoral candidate at the University of Miami and a student of the distinguished Dr. Roy sitting there. Her current research interests include international political economy, regional integration, and governance, with particular emphasis on education and economic development. She has been the recipient of a doctoral fellowship from our EUCE Center at the University of Miami. Beverly Barret received a master's degree in the program at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS, in Bologna, Italy, and in Washington, D.C., where she specialized in international economics and American foreign policy. And today she's going to talk with us about, let's see, did you change it? Oh, no, you did. Okay. Successes and challenges in policy implementation of the Bologna process, the political economy context in the EHEA.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's an honor to be here, and I've enjoyed the conference today and yesterday evening, and it's an honor to present before two dissertation committee members, Dr. Roy and Markus Thiel. So thank you both for encouraging me to make this presentation, and thank you for your patience at this long day, and thank you for your attention in this last presentation. It's an honor to be on this panel, and it's suitable to be on this panel because the EHEA is the European higher education area, and it's 47 countries. It's beyond the EU 27. An important member is Turkey, and we've spent a lot of time talking about Turkey today. Actually, this research I'm going to present focuses on the EU countries, but perhaps some of the lessons we take from looking at regions in the EU. This research is about 4 regions, Northern, Central, Eastern, Southern, can be applied to understanding other regions. And this presentation is a side project on my dissertation, which is Political Economy Influences on Implementing the Bologna Process. So to tie this into what we've been talking about today, the idea for the Bologna process originated with the Bologna process ministerial in Bologna, Italy. In 1999, there were 29 ministers of education who met at the time. But in 1997, the European Commission had a report towards a Europe of knowledge that stimulated this whole idea of a Europe of knowledge and the knowledge economy, an emphasis on innovation and services as economies moved from industrial focus to service focus along the transition from agriculture to industry to services. So the knowledge economy emphasis in the Europe of knowledge spurred the Bologna process